Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Amber Jamilla Musser, professor of English at the City University of New York. And we're talking about her book, Between Shadows and Noise, Sensation, Situatedness, and the Undisciplined. Probably should have practiced Situatedness. I didn't, still messed it up. But Dr. Musser, despite me not being able to say your book, welcome on the show. It's good to have you.
Thank you, PJ. It is good to be here.
So tell me a little bit, why this book? What led you to this project?
So the book is actually a culmination of my other books. So this is my third one. And as I was writing, I kind of saw it as a trilogy. And so I feel very relieved and happy that the trilogy is done. Though I'm going to keep writing, but, different types of things. So my first book is called Sensational Flesh, Race, Power, and Masochism. And there I used masochism as a frame for thinking about different ways that people were talking about the feeling of, or their experiences of power. So for example, I looked at how Frantz Fanon used the word masochism to talk about colonialism, and Simone de Beauvoir also used masochism to talk about feminism. And so the book ended up being an exploration of the way masochism stood in for thinking about subjectivity, sexuality, and sort of modernity, basically, and kind of that conglomeration. It wasn't really about masochism exactly per se, but it was like, why do people use this lens? And then from there, the end of that book was really, one of the things I realized was that race and gender kind of really interfere with this framework and make it hard for us to imagine the ways, say, Black women can use, or Black women don't have access to the same discourse to talk about sexuality. But obviously they experience sexuality. So then I wrote Sensual Excess, Queer Femininity, and Brown Jouissance, which looked at different frameworks and by using different works of art and different artists to think about expressivity of sexuality for women of color. And so I was like happy with that. And then I was like, well, it's kind of a slippery framework because a lot of these questions really depend on the perceiver. And so that's where Between Shadows and Noise comes in. And so I became really interested in questions of how do you pick up these kind of like other signals from people? What are different ways that we learn through the body? What are the ethics of kind of being open to things that you don't understand? So even though so that's kind of like where I ended up, right? So it's sort of far from where it started, but to me, it's still connected.
There's a path tracing through there.
Yeah.
So, and forgive me, I didn't go back through the other two books. When you talk about masochism, are we generally in the area of like, as you're talking about how it was applied and how this lens was applied, are we talking a little bit about like the internalizing of these oppressive frameworks?
Well, that was what was. So my background is in history of science, which I guess is probably where I should have started. So
no worries.
I've become very interested in how knowledge is transmitted and kind of the way it can mean different things to different people. So I was really strict about using the word masochism, but a lot of what I was doing was fleshing out the different ways that people were using it. So it wasn't really necessarily about keeping like, oh, masochism will always mean internalizing these thoughts about wanting to be dominated or wanting to experience pain or have to do with BDSM. But I was really interested in why people would use that word, given that, it obviously has like a rich history in both like erotica and in psychiatry. And sort of, so for me, it was really that kind of mystery about like, well, what are they trying to say when they're using this word? So sometimes it comes up in things that you might call contextual. And sometimes it feels, at least to me, like I was very surprised that Frantz Fanon used the word masochism, and he's using it not actually in the way that you would expect. He's not calling people who are colonized masochists, but he is calling people who colonize others masochists. Right. So it's like conventionally we would think about that. I mean, if we were going to use one of those terms, we would think like sadism. But he was using the framework of masochism because he was arguing that they were feeling it was their internalized guilt that made them act violently against others. But it was stemming from this idea. I know it's a very convoluted
No, that makes
thing, but
I am tracking with you. I just would not. That's why I asked, because I said, oh no, it's the other way, which is always fun to discover that. So kind of what you're doing, is there anything connected to kind of like the genealogical method? Are you kind of mapping out like the linguistic semantic territory, the historical territory of a word?
I mean, it's what my real interest is in sensation. And so thinking about the ways, so I mean, I am interested in the genealogical method, but I'm interested, I guess, in kind of like its breadth at every point. And there's certain words, like masochism is one of them, that I think just like can mean so many different things. So they're like denser with this
Yes.
possibility and denser with like these somatic attachments. Yeah. So one of the examples, so for me, part of it was not just kind of being like, okay, people use masochism differently. It was also aggregating those differences into kind of containers to be like, okay, so the way Fanon is talking about masochism is actually very similar to the way that anti-porn lesbian feminists are writing about masochism in the 1970s. And both of those depend on a binary view of power, where it's something that someone has and someone else does not, that it can't really be shared. And for me, that was a lot about the sensation of voyeurism and kind of like, so that was kind of a longer way of thinking about, okay, they're both using masochism. That lets me put them in conversation. And then I can use that to think about like what bodily feeling they're trying to get at by using masochism, right? Because it's like a theory of power, but it's also a theory of being in one's body.
Hence the sensation, which actually takes us to the third book, if I'm not mistaken. So uh, where does the name Between Shadows and Noise come from?
So that was actually a lot of where the project started. I found it a very evocative phrase, and
It is.
largely because it is, right? Largely because for me, they're both so difficult to fix, right? They both have such shifting meanings. And so I was really interested in trying to, and this is sort of going back to like this question of perception, right? So the idea of like what constitutes noise really depends on where you're sitting and what you're thinking about, what your value system is, right? Like what makes you comfortable, what makes you uncomfortable. Do you want the noise to resolve into something that feels legible? Are you okay with just like having the noise exist? And then shadow kind of has a different set of connotations where it is also shifting. But there we tend to think about shadows in relation to that which has been kind of like, well, is less exposed to light, right? So which has either been repressed or less consciously not visible, but sort of something that can make other things possible is generally like part of the system, but it's undervalued. So there the question is less about legibility and much more about value. So for me, these kinds of two systems and thinking about them together, which is kind of why I get the between, was really about that type of openness to the unknown that I was trying to get at in the project.
And forgive the maybe even a reference to internet culture here, but like when we talk about shadows, we're talking about kind of like that lurking, right? Is that a
Yes.
yes? Like
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what I like about. I mean, it's like they have lots of different things.
yes, yes. And then even as you're talking about the difference between like noise and something that would be more legible, you can tell a lot about how people feel. Like for instance, if they go to a soccer or football game, depending where you are, if someone says the roar of the crowd versus the noise of the crowd. Like someone who says the noise of the crowd is not watching the game and would much rather be at home. Like someone who says the roar of the crowd is excited to be there. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's kind of one of those things, because it's like sometimes you get projects where people are like excited about noise, but want to reclaim it and be like, but there's something valuable in that, like, da, da, da. And this isn't quite about that, right? It's not necessarily being like everything that we think is noisy, we need to like see in a different light. It's more just sticking with that, like, you know, what do you do when you want to repel?
Yeah. So I see you kind of go through different works here, starting with Us, which I have not seen. So you'll have to. I know. I did to be honest, I think I've watched maybe one adult movie in the last like year, maybe two in the last 2 years. So there's been a lot of reading, but not a lot of watching. So it is not I loved Get Out, right? I did the popular thing, and that came out before I had more children. So it's just, anyways, that's a whole other discussion. But so I've always loved Jordan Peele's work. So why this movie, and why this for chapter 1?
I know those are good questions. I guess we should perhaps. I think part of why you're asking that is that one of the underlying themes of the book itself is it's not only interested in thinking about what constitutes shadows and what constitutes noise, but because of that framework of situatedness and really thinking about like where we are and where we come from, like influences how we are perceiving things. A lot of the archive of the book is drawn through my own interest in finding the Caribbean in these other works of art, right? So the works of art themselves are not like necessarily from the Caribbean, and it's not a book about the Caribbean, but a lot of it is me tracing like, oh, I see a little bit of the Caribbean there. And Us in that way is like super weird because it is, even though you haven't seen it, I'm sure you already are aware that it is not about the Caribbean. It does not really have links there. So in that way, it sort of either had to go first or last, you know, because it was an outlier in that kind of way. But I picked it because I really just couldn't stop thinking about it. I don't even know if I want to say that I like love it. It's not like I'm like, oh, this is the most amazing movie I've ever seen in my life. But I think that there is a lot of really interesting work that Peele has kind of uncovered in relation to the way Black femininity functions in popular culture, which is to say that I think Peele has constructed Black female protagonists that generate a lot of anxiety. And so for me, it was really interesting to see that movie and unpack some of the ways that he makes the audience feel that, right? And that a lot of what's fascinating to me about the movie, and I will not spoil things for you, but it doesn't get resolved. Like, you know, you have like Get Out, like it sort of ends very triumphantly, but Us, like you just sort of leave and you're like, I'm not totally sure what to do. So that was kind of like one of the reasons why I was really drawn to the project itself. It also speaks a lot. One of the other currents that I'm interested in is the relationship between Blackness and empire. And so it speaks I wouldn't say directly to that, but it has like oblique lines towards those forms of connection, which were good for me to set up the rest of the project. And then I guess like pragmatically, there were definitely places, because a lot of the book treats shadows and noise as kind of, I don't want to say metaphors, but not necessarily as the actual materiality of shadows and noise and the ways that we tend to think about them. But this actually does. Yeah. There is a lot of noise, like the sonic is like a really important framework for thinking about the project. And then also the doppelgangers, at least you know that part.
Yeah.
The doppelgangers, like they refer to themselves as shadow. So, and there frequently are lots of shadows. So it gave me like also a way to start with the most concrete and then kind of build my arguments and then move.
Yeah.
through the
Yeah,
rest of the book.
that makes total sense. Yeah, I mean, and just as a personal note, I'm also I don't enjoy horror movies either. So that's like even as I'm like remembering the trailer and I'm like, oh yeah, I know it's probably a source of disappointment to some people, but I'm not going to watch it. That's gonna.
I know. I mean, it's sometimes it's, it's funny. For whatever reason, that's actually been the chapter that I talk the most about with this book, which is odd because in some ways it's like the least representative. And it produces, it's interesting because it kind of, even just talking about it, it acts a lot of my argument about it, which is that people get like very uncomfortable. Like it transmits a lot of, people are like, I hate horror. I don't know. Why are you going to make me watch this? Like, and I'm like, you don't have to, I mean, you really don't have to watch it. You can still, I think, read and enjoy the arguments. It's because it's not, I mean, it's an analysis of the film, but the stakes are sort of beyond the film.
Right.
But yeah,
Yeah, no, that's my brother loves horror. I'm sure he's seen it. He's a big film buff. And yeah. Sorry, that I don't know why I got into that personal side of it. I was like,
no, that's
I was just remembering as you were talking about like the doppelgangers and the shadows, and I was like, oh yeah, that would definitely, I'd be sitting there and I'm like, I'm 35 years old and I'm in my bed and I am definitely not scared. Definitely not, like
I mean, it's also, it's like now I've watched that movie like 8 times. I've watched it so many times. But I think what's fascinating about it, and this is kind of like part of, why I find it another object, is like the trailer gives away the whole plot. Like nothing different. I mean, obviously the movie is much longer than the trailer, but like nothing different happens, right? Like, I mean, yes, there is information that gets revealed, but like, the premise is right there, and the premise is like a very large part of the movie. But that's what makes it really interesting to think about, like the way Peele has produced. Well, Peele and the actors, right, have like produced this feeling, using shadows and noise, right, that like really make you feel this threat of Black femininity, right? And like the specific, she's like a threat in the house. She's a threat from outside the house. Like she is like either a socialist or she is, this like imperial force. Like there's a lot of different things going on. And then what you also see in the trailer, which is kind of what became extremely fascinating to me, is like that there's that young girl who keeps appearing. She sort of like narratively sets off the action for the whole plot. But throughout the film, she like appears and appears and appears. So that also made me think a lot about kind of what the cultural work of a young Black girl is doing when she interrupts in that way, right? Because we don't quite see her like grow up. We just sort of see her and connect her to these adults. And so it's kind of like, what is going on? So I found her like very, very fascinating. There was an original version of this where I was actually just going to talk about her in relation to the artist Betty Saar has this famous assemblage that's called Black Girl at the Window. And it's from 1969. And it's Saar is really invested in tarot and esoteric knowledge and things like that. And so it's just this silhouette of this Black girl with these different tarot cards and different things that have meaning for Saar. But that I was really drawn to like the parallel between like, they're both such opaque figures and just kind of being like, well, what are we trying to do with this Black girl,
I probably should have started with this, but I did want to ask about what is sensation, situatedness. I listened to you say it. I've been practicing it here. I don't know. You know what? It's situatedness. No, still not. Okay. And the undisciplined. Yeah. Okay. Anyways. Where did those 3 terms come from?
So sensation is definitely one that I've been working through through all of my writing, right? It's kind of like the thing that I'm most interested. I mean, well, that's a big claim. It's what I'm most excited about. Especially for me, it's connected to the history of science and really thinking about the way our bodies contain knowledge and allow us to share knowledge. And for me, it's really thinking a lot about the ways that sensation contains all of that and gives us it's tricky because it presents like a writing challenge and just like an articulation challenge. Like, how do you talk about sensation? But I do want us to sort of try to get at that kind of knowledge and really acknowledge that it is there and present and as important as the verbal knowledge that we sort of more generally prioritize. And then situatedness is, for me, that's really coming from a long lineage of Black feminism, which, I'm thinking a lot with Theory in the Flesh, which was coined by Gloria Alzandua and Sherry Moraga in this bridge called My Back, which is an anthology of women of color writing. But a lot of what they do there is sort of, really get at the ways that what we know is about where we are. It's not quite about like the identities that we inhabit exactly, but it's just sort of that, our experiences in the world have led us to these particular perspectives. And so we can learn from each other from these perspectives. So for me, that kind of ethical imperative of situatedness and that acknowledgement that difference is a part of all of us and difference is something that we need to prioritize is like a big part of kind of the like why of this project, right? To sort of prioritize difference, which also means that even though I'm providing my own readings of different works of art, the goal is not to be like, this is the definitive reading of us or, anything else, as much as to be like, this is my reading, you can have your reading. And the goal really is to just have like a bunch of different readings and to sort of enlarge through difference what all of these things can mean rather than kind of like winnow down into just one thing. And that brings me to the Undisciplined, which I'm seeing as a lot of the ways that we've sort of we have been trained is I see it a lot as the disciplining of the senses. It's kind of like, what are the things that matter? Like the visual has been given a lot of priority. The linguistic has been given a lot of priority. So these kinds of things tend to dominate when we are in front of something. They organize our interpretation of them and they organize what we think of as being valuable. And so part of this project of thinking with the bodies that we all bring to things and the differences that those bodies contain is to work towards undisciplining and kind of allowing us to really sit in the unruliness that each of us can unlock within these different works of objects. And sort of like more generally, just sort of to open up to think about like, well, what are the different possible modes of being and thinking with this material and just being and thinking in general.
Is that intentionally ambiguous, the discipline, undisciplined, the idea of like there's a subject matter that is a discipline, but there's also it takes discipline to, is it covering all that semantic range or is there one or the other that you prioritize?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Unfortunately, it is trying to cover all of it. I mean, a lot of it.
I love that kind of work. No, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is. I know it's kind of like yes, all. But some of it is also connected to my interest in thinking about empire, right, and sort of like the long tail of empire in this project. Largely because the ways that we've been given to prioritize different forms of knowledge are related to these processes of colonialization, which tell us like, lines need to look like this, categories look like this looks like that, like all of those things are part of that. And so the undisciplining is in some ways it's not equivalent to decolonization, but it is related to that mode of trying to like move outside those strict lines. But that's also sort of like why it's ambiguous, because it's not just like one particular discipline is like worse than or better than any other. It's just sort of like the general project of organizing knowledge.
I think
I say as I wrote a book.
Yeah, well, I think I personally, that's part of the interdisciplinary side of things. A lot of my own work is on how philosophy and art interact. So this idea of polysemy in the use of undisciplined, I think is really cool. So don't apologize to me. Maybe there's someone else who takes issue with that, but I think that I really love that you did that. This is just Right. I need to stop doing this. I'm looking up how to say situatedness. I can't. I don't even know what's wrong with my brain. I can't do it. Okay. I need to let that go and not be insecure. And you know what? Sometimes now I know how Benedict Cumberbatch feels when he says he can't say penguin. So this is the way that works. All right. It's okay. So as we talk about kind of. Can you talk about what Shango is and what is it? What is a spectacle of the spirit? This is chapter 2 for our audience. I realize I just kind of you're like, what? I'm like, we are following the structure of the book, and I am just letting go of the arrogance that I can pronounce things, and that's okay.
So the first chapter is us, and the first chapter ends with me meditating on the image, kind of in my mind's eye, of my mother as a young girl in the Caribbean, in St. Vincent. And then the second chapter sort of leads us more directly into the Caribbean with Shango, which is a dance piece that was choreographed by Katherine Dunham in the 40s. And Dunham was a dancer and an anthropologist, and also became indoctrinated into the voodoo tradition. And so Dunham based Shango on a version of a Shango, which is a Trinidadian religion, ritual. But originally, the piece was performed as part of the last, it's like, what is that called? The last number in a Broadway play that Dunham did. And it was kind of like interrupting the narrative, but sort of doing its own thing. And then later Dunham performed it in repertoire with her dancers all across the world. So Shango is interesting because they're like full recordings of it do not exist. So I was writing about this object that I have only seen a tiny clip of one part of. I know that the ALA company has done it since, but I have not seen that, nor have I seen. I didn't want to see their recording because that was sort of not quite the point. But what I became really interested in was because Dunham became a voodoo initiate, so sort of knew. So at the time that she was choreographing and conducting her anthropological research, she was not as involved in voodoo as she would become. But this means that the dance piece for me is like very, very slippery because it's a depiction of a ritual, but also done by someone who knows something about the ritual, but therefore has incentive to kind of cloak what is going on. And then because it's being performed for predominantly white audiences who are seeing Dunham, which is to say, like, not outside of the circuit of people who would be at a voodoo ceremony more generally, that charge of sort of like that spectacleness has this like extra thing. So on the one hand, we can sense that like Dunham is making it more exotic for these audiences because that's what they want. But also not presenting necessarily everything about what could be going on to preserve her own relationship or her own idea of authenticity around these particular rituals, right? So there's a lot of, so I became very interested in kind of like, what exactly, how can we locate authenticity in what Dunham is doing? Not that the answer is that we have to, and that there is one specific site of authenticity, but just that, in some ways that was kind of like Dunham's desire as an anthropologist is to find authenticity. But then there's sort of like these layers of spectacle because of being a choreographer and a performer. And then there are also layers of spectacle to being someone who's on the inner circle of a religion, who's sort of not really supposed to be exposing that much about their religion elsewhere. And voodoo itself is like notoriously impervious to representation. And so then as I was kind of like uncovering more into this and getting kind of like lost in the like, oh my God, like, what's happening here? People were also arguing, Dunham has a memoir that's about her experiences with voodoo. And there she is like, I went to the ceremony and I didn't feel anything. And then people are sort of like, well, did she or did she not? Maybe she thought that it was going to look a certain way, but it didn't. So she actually did experience it, but didn't know that she did because there's its own, I know, there's like its own spectacle of spirit. So I got, so that's kind of like these circuits of just sort of like expectation versus like what that was part of what I was trying to get at. And then ultimately a lot of what I was thinking, I was reading other things about people talking about other representations of voodoo ritual, not necessarily Shango. And they were sort of saying, well, if you know, you know. You can say it's a representation, but if you're really in it and your spirit feels called, it is authentic. So that totally, upended the whole thing. But I was really interested in kind of what can be made visible, what might it mean to feel that calling, what, like those sorts of tensions that for me really reside like very deeply in the body. And I think Dunham herself is like a fascinating person around, she herself grew up in Illinois with a French-Canadian mother and an American father. And so, is very associated with Haiti, but is not from there. Right. And so just sort of like that tension between insider and outsider and what does that mean in this context and sort of, what is the role of spirit were all kinds of questions that I was interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Forgive me, around what time did Shango come out? Like what year? Or rough what?
I was like, I need to look at
Well, I mean, what decade? Are we talking
late,
like
late 40s?
Late 40s.
No,
okay,
no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that definitely is going to give us a very different kind of spectacle than if it was out in the 70s, if it was out in the 80s, 90s, if it was out today. I mean, of course, there's going to be this pressure to exoticize it, right? And that's really
well, go ahead. Yeah. I was gonna say, I mean, and like in that specific context of like Jim Crow America, right? The status of Black people who were not from America was like much more exoticized and eroticized than Black people from America, right? So there are like lots of different layers about like who the spectacle is appealing toward. And at that same time, the US is actually like very involved it has a military base in Trinidad, right? So there are these like other imperial connections that are not necessarily, again, super explicit, but are, I think, part of that story. And within Trinidad, there's a whole, I don't want to say anxiety, but anxiety about Black female sexuality being, I don't want to say corrupted, but basically like the soldiers taking the Trinidadian women. And so a lot of what Dunham's show was trying to do is to be like Black female sexuality, but people were like, no, this is not, we are not happy with that. So it's there's like lots of different kinds of things happening.
Yeah. And as you're coming at it from a history of science background, it seems like it's important that Dunham was also an anthropologist, right? Like she is passing on a form of knowledge through art, but there is a scientific bent to that she is doing an anthropologist's work. Is that part of the reason why that's so fascinating to you and so important in this book?
Yes, yeah. No, I mean, exactly. It's just sort of, that she's existing at a lot of the tensions that I'm interested in exploring. She's sort of like wanting to make this embodied knowledge rational. And, like you can read her notes and you can read like some of the things have been published where she's really talking about these rituals. But then there's the tension between that and then her as a participant. And so there's that kind of question about sort of like, what does, how involved you get, like when you get involved, like what does that do to the knowledge? Like what kind of, what is the end result? And I mean, I think it's very telling that even though she does have a degree in anthropology, she obviously went forward more in dance, right? And then at some point was just, she didn't complete her master's thesis, I don't believe. And so she did all the research for it, but she didn't write it up, but still persisted in performing and like translating the knowledge that way.
It's a little bit of a leap, but there's some similarities. I just interviewed Dr. Adri Kusaro. I don't know if you know that name. And so she is an anthropologist and an ethnographer who works with trauma, specifically like political asylum seekers. And but she wrote her book, Trauma Mantras, as prose poems
Oh,
because she found that the scientific kind of language could not capture what was really going on. And it actually leads me to my next question to you, which is, um, what do you see as valuable about the personal in this kind of academic work? Because you put a lot of yourself in here, right? And so you feel like
yeah.
that's important. Why is that important?
I mean, it's sort of twofold. I mean, one, it's kind of it felt like there was no way that I could really make an argument about the importance of situatedness and sort of like who and where one is and comes from without putting myself in there as well. Because then it just becomes very, I mean, as I'm just sort of demonstrating, right? It just becomes abstract like very quickly and sort of loses, you're like, well, what does that mean? Who cares, right? It's sort of, it is important to the story that the reader know that my mother is from the Caribbean,
Mm.
right? Otherwise, it just sort of becomes like, this is a very weird archive. Like, why did you do this? Why are you noticing this? I will say that it was a very tricky balance because I wanted to have that information there to help the book cohere and to sort of reinforce my argument that what I was seeing, because I think it becomes clearer like, okay, you can see, like, I know this about her. This makes sense to me that she's seeing this.
Mm.
And balancing it with the like, not, it's not an autobiography, right? Like, there's personal information, but there's not really like, there are not many events. It's not about like, and this is how I became who I am, or this, this type of thing. And so it was very tricky to kind of balance that out because I think people are very seduced by voyeurism and like
Mm.
really want to know like, oh, here's somebody telling me about their life. Like, I want to know what happens. Like, it becomes, so trying to put it in a way that it didn't overwhelm the academic arguments that I wanted to make was also like a really tricky thing. So it's more like there's a lot in the very beginning in the introduction where I'm sort of like, this is, where I come from. And there's a lot in the conclusion. But the rest of it, it's kind of just like more little snippets to kind of help give context, but especially to give context not only to the situatedness, but also to the sensations, right? Because a lot of the time, like the Dunham chapter, I haven't really mentioned it yet, but so in addition to being about spirituality, the bodily orientation that I'm thinking about is about fascia. And so there was kind of like no real way to talk about, the experience of like the knots in my fascia without talking about the knots in my fascia and without
Mm.
sort of giving some kind of qualitative, like, yes, I experienced them in this way, and these are the emotions that come with that and that. But that's not like a longue durée history of things. It's not like when I was 4, I had this, and then, but it's just enough to sort of to anchor the project in the body as well. But there was, there is that tension with like not wanting people to be like, oh my God, and then what?
Yeah,
What
yeah,
happened?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I'm making a point. Can you stop asking me about my medical history now? That was just to illustrate. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
so um, the first point, yeah, the first thing that you're talking about with that is the response to situatedness. Situatedness. I think I might have actually said it right that time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you did. Yeah.
But and so the second one was the second thing that you're talking about is that you were trying to avoid voyeurism, or did I miss the second the second
Well, the
reason
second is
why?
also just that it's hard. It's really hard to talk about sensation in the abstract without
Ah,
going to like like actually giving bodily examples.
so there has to be some kind of are we in like the realm generally of like phenomenology? Like you have to have some kind of first person account when you're talking about sensation.
Yeah. Yeah.
I understand.
I mean, it's tricky.
Yeah. I understand like there's like specific ways you do phenomenology, but you know, like this idea of the first person structure, if that.
Yes, yeah. Well, to give, because a lot of what I want to emphasize is, the way bodies know. And if part of what I'm arguing is that like bodies transmit information in the way that you feel, right? Like both sensation and through emotion. There's no real way to do that, to sort of be like, I can't just say like, I'm in front of this object. And I have feelings. Like that would be so, I don't think that would work. That wouldn't be very satisfying. So I had to really like kind of describe and then also, excavate a little bit around the feelings that I was having.
I've read stuff like that where it's like I had feeling one, and then feeling one it came through these kinds of, and it's like, can you just tell me like I can't envision what you're talking about, please? Like it's interesting how this dovetails like with a lot of my own work in philosophical hermeneutics, as we talk about the way I was just recently reading Charles Taylor. He's talking about Pierre Bourdieu and the way that knowledge is carried in the body. And I was talking to a friend of mine who I was trying to make a point about something, and he was a very good baseball player. And I was like, you understand that like if you go up to hit a baseball, the knowledge is in your hands. And you know this because if you try to teach someone how to hit a baseball, you'd have to stop and think about what is in your hands, right? The language isn't there. It's in, and that's kind of that, I think Bourdieu has that whole book, The Logic of Practice. Does he show up kind of, is he like, would he be alongside your work? Does that?
I mean, that's actually a really great interlocutor. Yeah. I mean, he specifically does not show up.
Right.
But that's partially, it's kind of complicated. It's partially because it was because of like the political framing that I'm going for. But absolutely, what he's saying about habitus is like very similar to what I'm saying about situatedness. I think I'm trying to not just sort of, well, I mean, I think he's sort of more interested in like broadening out and kind of being like, all of these people will then produce the same kinds of, will like have similar, like reach for this. I mean, I feel like I literally showed up once to something with a friend of mine from grad school, and we were wearing the same very niche outfit. And I was like, this is wild. Yeah. It was exactly that. I mean, I was like, yes. And so I guess like in distinguishing what I'm doing, because that's definitely very, very related. But it's less about kind of trying to trace like what the commonalities might be, and more, I guess, trying to see like what the vectors of connection given that might be. Right. So it's less about like how all the people I went to grad school with might have, or not all, but, certain ones of them and I might have things in common, and more just sort of like, okay, I have had this experience so that when I see this work of art, this can be a point of connection for me. Right. Or like, because I've had this experience, and so for me, the history of science part also comes in terms of like, I've had this experience. This means that my view of the world, right? Like during the pandemic, I took a lot of herbalism classes. I don't know, because I was like, Zoom and making this an option.
Everyone picked up a hobby during the pandemic. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And so I was like, well, because of that, when I see like the tamarind in the Titus Kaphar sculpture, I'm really interested in like what healing properties it has. Right. So it's not just like, but somebody else who doesn't have that particular, or I'm also drawn to the tamarind because my mother is from the Caribbean. Right. So like those things are going to influence like what that work of what jumps out at me, like what I'm sensing, and then also how I'm interpreting it. Right. And so that's why it's like related, but different from from habitus.
Yeah, and please don't. That was not intended in any way to be a critique.
No.
This is me trying to put your work kind of in a, where does it, if we think of these as like constellations, where does your work fit in the sky, right? Like,
Yeah. No,
obviously
I
it's very
think that was a
different.
great. No, well, and I mean, I would say like in that way, I mean, I am actually very influenced by French philosophy. So I think like the Bourdieu makes a lot of sense. I do talk a little bit about Jacques Rancière in
Yeah.
the thing, partially because, related to Habitus, like he has all of that work on the disciplining of the senses and like the sensus communis. And like that part of the task of education is to be like, we are all paying attention to the same things, which we can see like how that, I'm not going to say that that feeds into the habitus, but how it's also like alongside in these particular ways, right? And then like we even have like the Foucault and genealogy also is like akin to kind of, but which is to say like these are all questions about the relationship between epistemology and ontology, right? And I think we're just sort of articulating them to different ends, to slightly different ends. But I think I would put us, I can see that as like the common thread.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I was a little bit. This happens to me a lot in this show, but I was rebuked because I have Rancière on my shelf, but I have not read him yet. So I saw it and I was like, "Dang it!" I knew I needed to read that. Too late. Okay, and I'm fine with this, that we're not going to be able to get through all your book, because that's why people should go and read your excellent book, right? But I would like to talk about because I love cooking. Talk to me about tamarind and the uses of tamarind. I actually just made and we won't talk about I say this as naively as possible. Following a recipe on YouTube, a Sri Lankan fish curry. Like I realize that that feels very colonizing, like just randomly play. Yeah. But and it was fun. It was fun to like, I mean, had to dig through the grocery store to find tamarind paste. Like that's not something like you have to go hunting for that, right? I'm in Central Florida. It's Publix, right? It's not like, anyways. But so what are the uses of tamarind and how? Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you did I love that you did that partially because it echoes my own experience of cooking with tamarind, which is like also mediated through a screen,
Yes.
but like a Zoom call, not
Right.
not YouTube. And I similarly was like, I don't know where I'm gonna find it, but I did.
Right.
It worked out, but so as I was saying, right? So I became really interested in this Titus Kaphar sculpture, which he describes as the bust of George Washington on its side on a slab of marble. It's a very distorted bust, but inside there's rum, lime, tamarind, and molasses corked. And the sculpture is called A Pillow for Fragile Fictions. I was like, this is so fascinating. There's sort of a straightforward reading, which puts it in conversation with, because we know it's a bust of George Washington, with this enslaved man named Tom that Washington exchanged for those quantities. So that was like one place to go. And I was like, cool.
Yeah.
But as I was saying before, right, I was really intrigued by the presence of tamarind, partially because for as long as I could remember, my mother has been like, my favorite candies are tamarind balls. I love them. I was like, okay. I had always been like, I don't know about this. I was little. It was just like a little too tart for me. And then, but I was still thinking with this tamarind, and then another pandemic hobby on Zoom was this friend of mine did cooking classes for us. And so she is Pakistani, but she cooks like a lot of different South Asian cuisine. And so one of the dishes was this Burmese curry. And that was the first time that we used tamarind. And I was just like, oh my God, I know, like now I understand what this flavor is. And so it was very cool to see like feel in my body, like, okay, this is when you add the tamarind. This is what it does. Cause I had tasted it before, I tasted it after. I was like, okay, I know this. And to put that in conversation, because as I said, like at the same time, I was doing these pandemic herbalism classes. And to put that in conversation, to be like, that is such a complex flavor. But like, there must be some like, herbal mechanism that's also happening. And I became really interested in teasing out the possibility, like I don't think tamarind is not, it's not like the most pertinent herbal remedy. Like, I'm not going to say like go out and everybody have tamarind and you're going to feel great. I mean, it tastes good, but it's not like that. But it led me down this kind of way to think about the possibilities of people using this tamarind in food during during the time of enslavement, because it's grown in a lot of tropical countries alongside sugarcane, right? And contrasting the way sugar is linked with so much death and speed and modernity and all of these things. And tamarind, which is like a much smaller crop, is like a flavoring agent, but also can stimulate ideas of, or can stimulate digestion because it is like a little bitter. That's what I'm saying. It's not, if you really want to stimulate digestion, have like daffodil leaves, but not like not tamarind. But it led me into really this kind of, I would say, imaginary place of thinking with the possibilities for rest and sort of locating in that Kafar sculpture tamarind as this kind of like resistive agent, right? Like, because it suggested these like cooking possibilities. Because I feel like no one really cooks with tamarind unless you're a tropical cook, because like what, you probably don't have access to it or the knowledge of exactly what to do with it. But that it also had these qualities. So for me, that was like a fun way of kind of putting it together to really think about like, you can't really, the whole liquid, it's not like you can differentiate the tamarind, but to really think about the thing that's like, it's there, but its meaning is like so embedded in the ways that we like know our bodies and know what these things are. And then, it kind of like unfurls in these so many possible ways, but they're like contained within the sculpture, but like also not at all visible in it. Yeah. So that was my cooking thing.
Yeah. I mean, but what's, I've done a good amount of work with I do a lot of cooking. I cook for the family. So we have 9 people in our house. So there's a lot of cooking, right? And even from a health perspective, just you want to have a variety that you eat. And what's really fascinating to me, even as we're talking about the imperial tendencies, the imperialist problems, is that we have now global access to food, but we are eating a less variety. And whereas if we ate local, we eat more diverse because of the mechanisms that go into that. And that's one of those things like, we feel like you feel like you have to explain that tamarind is not this cure-all, but it is good, and it, among a bunch of other things, it's good. I don't know if that's kind of a half-formed thought, but go ahead.
No, I mean, absolutely. Well, there was so many, one of the sort of like weird fringe benefits of it wasn't like I was learning these things for the book, but knowing that I was interested in thinking a lot about different types of embodied knowledge, like really freed me up to just sort of be like, I'll just take a class in this, or I'll just like explore this and see, because obviously you don't know what you're going to learn. I mean, I learned how to cook, but I feel like more I learned how to taste and how to like think about food in a different kind of way. And then with the herbalism also, I mean, like one of the major tenets is like eat a lot of different kinds of things.
Right.
Like exactly as you're saying, right? And just that the ways that these different types of knowledge like really reorient your mode of being in the world, right? Like that's, I think, the like one of the other underlying political frames for this project is just sort of like, there's so many ways to be in the world, and we've just been kind of like narrowed down into, or disciplined into, like one particular way that is not necessarily especially healthy, or but just sort of to kind of broaden out those things in whatever ways that we can is part of it, right? So cooking different foods is part of it. I think, this access, thinking about like what spirituality means and sort of like what the limits are between the self and other, like, I think those are also really important parts of it. I think, I got really interested, because there are a few different elements of spirituality throughout the book, right? I talk a lot about like the chakra system and Chinese traditional medicine, as well as voodoo. But just sort of all of these ways, like they shift how you are in the world, and they also, for my purposes, right, like also shift like what it means to be a body. And like when we say bodily knowledge, like that really, we tend to think about it as like, okay, like my muscles and my, like all my brain mind connection. But if you really are in these systems, like it actually means very different, it's not, your body doesn't quite end there, right? Or like it's not quite in those ways. So I was really interested in that dimension as well.
And forgive me, it might be a silly example, but I think as you talked about at the beginning, valuing difference, and you're talking about these different ways of being, and the baseline for our culture is commoditization. My aunt, who's a nurse, heard that turmeric was really good for you, and she drank so much, and so immediately, she drank so much, she actually got turmeric poisoning. I didn't know you could do this. She actually got sick. And so, and that's like, it's this kind of idea that we have this, which I think, that was odd. I didn't know that was possible. But that's exactly the sort of idea that's like, oh, this is good for me. I'm just going to like, it's just an equation. It's just I think in your description, even you talk about overdetermined parameters. You're like, this is good for me, therefore I can just drink as much as I want and I'll just get better. And it's like, no, it's this whole intertwined system where we can value difference, because you can't get everything just from the turmeric, right? I know that's a little bit silly, but like, I mean, that's like I think a very clear example of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's I think you're totally right.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in a few, no, and I mean, I think it's right in a few ways, right? So, I mean, it's exactly like the answer is not to sort of sub out something that is unhealthy and just sub in one other thing, right? Like that's not, the point is, right, like of one of the things I was like really, I'm definitely not trying to generalize across all the different frames of knowledges that I was looking at, partially, because that would be not the point.
That wouldn't be valuing difference. Yes.
No. But I will say the ways that people are approaching balance and sort of like what constitutes I think there's always a theory of balance and like what it is to be well placed in health, right? Like, or in space, like spiritual, all these different things. And like what that means varies. But I think that concept of balance is not very American right now. But it's just, but it's sort of like realizing.
Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, no, but if you think about like what that really means, it's also, so yes, it's about balance, but it's also about like really seeing the way people are entangled with like the spaces around them, like their environments, the other people, other types of thoughts, right? Like that. And that's also part of difference, is like having access to all of these things. But it is also a really different framework from this idea of like being a contained being towards really, I mean, I think what people are using now is kind of like this framework of the ecological, which I don't quite use in the book, but it's like of a part of kind of understanding being as like porous and, because it's like once you understand that porosity, that's where you can get towards like, well, what might balance mean, right? That it's not, you can't just like add in turmeric. Right. You have to like... Something also, it's funny because that same friend who taught me how to cook, like she gave me a bunch of, anyway, lots of the recipes that she gave me have a lot of turmeric, but she definitely was just like, if you're taking any blood thinners, do not use this because turmeric is also an anti-inflammatory. So like, it was not just, even though turmeric was good, it was not always good.
Right. Well, I mean, that's just basic toxicology too, right? Like, it's all in the dosage. Oh, man. You've been very patient with me today with my mispronunciations, and I don't know what it is, but I'm all over the place today. So one, thank you for coming on today. I want to be respectful of your time. But if I could ask you one last question for our audience, besides reading your book, which they should, and get to all the rest of the chapters that we didn't even get to touch on, what is something that you would ask from our audience just to think on, to meditate on as they go about their week after listening to this episode?
Ooh, that is a hard question. I think, I guess going back to this idea of balance, like there are two, I guess like two concrete outputs that I think are useful from the book. And one is the idea of attunement, and just sort of like thinking, which I think really means just kind of trying to pay attention to sort of like where you are and when you are, and not necessarily judging it, but just sort of like being in that space. And I think then for me, the related thing is this idea of the body place, which is kind of that like we don't just end at the bodies, but we are part of these broader things. And so I think kind of like the more, if we can keep thinking of ourselves as in these like expansive, not like egoic, but just like expansive and enmeshed beings, I do think that that leads to a gentler orientation toward the world and sort of a different set of priorities. So I feel like that's my takeaway.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's really, it's really encouraging. I think we could definitely use a gentler orientation to the world. Dr. Musser, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.